Hi, and welcome back to the Contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles. If you enjoy Westerns, I hope you'll hit the subscribe and notification icons. I'd truly appreciate your support. If you're enjoying the story and you're interested in a copy of my novel, Hunting Charm, you can check my Amazon page or contact me directly through my Patreon page. I'll have links to both in the description below. Again, any support is deeply appreciated. In today's episode, you'll hear Chapter 10 of my novel, Hunting Charm. If you haven't listened to the previous chapters, let me encourage you to do so. I have the first 9 chapters in a playlist. In today's Plate of History Beans, I'm going to move away from my examination of the Indian territories and cattle drives and talk about dime novels from the 19th century. The two main characters in Hunting Charm, Hunter Brantley and Matt Grayson, also star in a series of dime novels. Though the idea is somewhat anachronistic in its conception, it isn't entirely impossible. Starting in around 1860, dime novels were widely available. They were one of the things you would find at the local mercantile, and they helped shape today's notions of the Old West, as authors of the time sensationalized the exploits of heroic and cowboys and detectives. Matt and Brent are cowboy detectives. In Chapter 10, Bucky Baylor accidentally shoots his brother based upon something he read in a dime novel. At any rate, I'll let you listen to the story. Without further ado, here's Chapter 10 of Hunting Charm, A Dead Mule and an Errant Shot. Chapter 10, A Dead Mule and an Errant Shot. Bucky, my butt can't take a bit more. Let's camp right here. After traveling for over 6 days across unbroken prairie, the tempers of both of the Baylor brothers had grown short. Bart, especially, still stinging from the loss of the bacon, spent a great deal of time complaining. "We ain't shopping for wasting another hour. I'm looking for a pleasant place to put down for a day or two. We need to rest the mules. The one on the left has me worried. He's been favoring his front right leg. If one of these animals comes up lame, we'll be in a fix for sure." "Well, I sure as hell wouldn't complain about resting for a day or two. I say we head back to Abilene. I think those Indians give us bad direction. We discussed this 100 times. If you have a better idea about the directions, then spit it out." "Well, why don't we go over to one of these forts? Hell, we saw at least 700 Indians, and ain't one of them had any idea about where we're going. Maybe we could talk to a white man about it. That old feller yesterday seemed to think Johnson was living with some folks called the Skogies or some such," Bucky grumbled. "Well, hell, then let's go straight to them Skogies, why don't we? Hell, I heard they're living off in that direction somewhere." Bart waved his arm in a wide circle. "Your negative attitude is about to wear me out. Why don't you stop your yapping?" "Well, why don't you make me?" "I'm about to." Bucky snapped the reins, causing the mules to bolt. "Dang it!" Bart roared. "Stop the wagon. I'll walk it from here. I'm tired of your driving and farting. Farting and driving. Driving and farting. You got no call to say anything about the stinkers. If you hadn't let them Indians take our bacon, we would have something to eat other than beans. I'm sick of hearing about the dang bacon. Was I supposed to get us both scalped over a side of salt pork? Slow this wagon down." Bart reached across and jerked at the reins. One of the animals stopped abruptly while the other bucked and then jerked hard against the traces. The wagon surged and then let out a tremendous creaking sound. A second later, the two left wheels rose slowly from the ground. A moment after that, thanks to the incline, it became obvious the entire wagon was going to roll onto its side. The two brothers launched themselves from the buckboard, flailing to avoid cactus and an inopportune mesquite. When the wagon came to a rest on its right side, the two mules, tangled in the rigging, stood in a state of snorting uneasiness as Bucky and Bart squared off. "You darn fool, I'm going to kick your tail." Bucky swung wildly, but Bart ducked and drove his shoulder into his brother's midsection. They did a brief off-balance sumo grapple, collided with the wagon, then fell to the ground where they rolled around groaning and cursing for the next half minute. Then it was over. 45 seconds into the fight, Bucky and Bart lay on their backs staring at the sky, both men panting desperately. "Dang fool," Bucky said. "You're the fool for volunteering in the first place." "Yeah, well, if you wouldn't drive the dang wagon so fast, we wouldn't have landed on our side. Our supplies are all spread out on the..." "Just shut up, Bart. You're the one got us into this mess, and you ain't done nothing but whine." "Well, sir, if you hadn't given up all our bacon, I wouldn't be whining half so much. If I ate another bean, I'm liable to shit." "Would you shut the hell up about the dang bacon?" They tussled for an additional 5 seconds, then again lay panting on their backs. They exchanged a few breathless curses, then, for over a minute, said nothing. Finally, Bucky said, "You remember how Papa used to get them pains in his shoulder when he gets all riled up? Then he'd get it so he could hardly breathe." "Yep. Doc said it's something that happens, well, to folks that's heavy and all. Said it was something to do with Daddy's heart." "Yep. You ever get them pains in your arm?" Bucky asked. "I get short of breath, but I ain't had no pain in my arm." Bucky nodded, massaging his left shoulder. The pair might have remained there for several minutes, but the mules, still tangled in the reins and traces, began bickering between themselves. One of the mules tended to bite, especially toward the end of a long day, and began snapping its jaw at the second mule, causing it to tangle itself even more as it attempted to flee. "Shit!" Bucky rolled onto his sizable gut and pushed himself up from the ground. Bart followed suit, and soon both men were back on their feet, quieting the mules and examining the buckboard. As fortune would have it, the wagon hadn't sustained any significant damage, but one of the mules seemed hobbled. Bucky examined the animal's hooves, nodding his head despondently. "He's got a split there in his left rear hoof. This ain't good. Can he still pull some?" "I reckon he'll have to, or else we'll just use the one and let this one wander along behind. Dang, he was a rest puller." "Should we camp for the night and let that leg rest a spell?" "Well, sir, we could do that, but it's early yet and we need water. Been a couple of dry days." They righted the wagon, hitched the lame mule behind, and things were fine until they came to a ravine. The variation in their pathway wasn't especially challenging. They had pulled through worse, but both men worried that the single healthy mule lacked sufficient power to get them up the opposing side. Bucky climbed down and walked into the gully, examining the slope. "We got to load up what supplies we can on the good mule and walk it from here." "Walk it?" Bart exclaimed. "We can't go walking cross country. We ain't built for long spells on foot." "How the hell do you suggest we cross this here gully?" "We could get behind the wagon and push her along while the mule pulls." "Won't work. Without that other mule, we can't do it." "Why did you come this way?" "I came this way 'cause we're traveling easterly." See, now we're back on that again. Why easterly? For all you know, we were 3 miles from that mule farmer's house when that bunch of Comanches sent us off in this direction. You put your trust in a pack of bacon-stealing savages. Just leave it be for once. We might be able to get up the opposite side there by using rocks to chalk up the wheels every few feet. I sure hate to leave Mr. Tarwater's wagon behind. We can't walk all the way to Abilene. Plus, Mr. Tarwater will likely make us pay for it if we come on without it." "Oh, yeah, he will." Crossing the ravine proved to be as difficult as Bucky had imagined. Getting down the slope, naturally, took only a few minutes. They spent the next hour attempting to climb the gentle slope up the other side, even with 2 men shoving from behind, chalking the wheels with rocks every few feet. They lacked the power to move the load effectively. About 2/3 of the way up the slope, they came to a raised bit of embankment. Bucky had been surveying the spot the entire time, and as predicted, the 18-inch escarpment ended their progress. Bart suggested digging ruts through the raised line of dirt, but both realized doing so would require hours of labor. With a sigh, they scotched both rear wheels and stepped back. "I don't think we can pull over that hump there," Bucky said. "I've been looking at it all along," Bart said, "and I think I got an idea." "Okay." "I was thinking we could tie a line round yonder hackberry and hitch up the lame mule up top on the level ground. We could fix up a slip knot in the rope so when we make a little ground, we could take up the slack. We got at least 100 feet of rope." Bucky considered his brother's plan. "What's the mule doing up top there?" Bucky squinted at the hackberry, then spat a gob of tobacco juice onto a grasshopper. "Just for extra leverage. He'll be pulling too, but since he's on level ground, he won't have to get too much weight on his sore foot. Maybe one of us could get up there with the other mule just to keep it soothed down." Bucky calculated the distance and angle between the tree and the wagon and decided the plan might work. The hefty twins rigged their winch line and hitched the lame mule at the top of the incline. Bart complained a bit more about the bacon, saying, "Little hog grease would be handy to lubricate the rope." "Feel free to trim a slice off your fat gut," Bucky replied. "Funny. You ready down there?" Bucky called down to Bart, who waited behind the wagon. Bart waved to indicate his readiness. Amazingly, when Bart gave the reins a slap, the wagon surged forward, and the front wheels bounced over the 18-inch rise. Unfortunately, the force of the violent bump sent shockwaves through the wooden frame of the cart, and with a wrenching sound, the right rear wheel cracked. The sound was so loud, even Bucky at the top of the hill knew something had happened. Before either of them could do anything, the wagon tilted precipitously. Then the broken wheel screeched and separated from the axle. Bart shouted frantically, grabbing the healthy mule and scrambling to scotch the remaining wheels. Bucky came lumbering down the hill, too far away to help. A moment later, the wagon let out a second screeching sound and slipped several feet back down the hillside. "Scotch the dang wheels!" Bucky panted. With a near superhuman effort, Bart managed to get a rock behind the left front wheel. The wagon shuddered to a sudden stop, but the scotch didn't hold. The wagon shifted again and rolled over the rock. Ropes and reins and mules and men started down the hillside. For a moment the wagon gained speed, but just As it seemed the thing would roll all the way back to the bottom of the ravine, it came to a sudden and shuddering halt. The rope line tied to the hackberry at the top of the hill had done its job. Unfortunately, the rope had also pinned the lame mule against the hackberry tree in a most hideous way. Both men saw immediately the mule's spine couldn't possibly bend at such an odd angle. For the next 30 seconds, a strangled braying came from the poor equine's throat. A sound so terrible, both men shuddered in horror. Bucky scrambled back up the hill, pulling himself along with the shivering taut rope. He was trying to decide if he should cut the line when the animal's deafening braying died away to a pitiful mewling. Then the animal went limp and silent, its seemingly lifeless body still supporting the entire weight of the wagon 30 yards down the hillside. Bart managed to unhitch the good mule, then, obtusely, he secured the animal by tying it to the rear of the wagon. He then came wheezing up the hillside. "You think he's dead?" Bart asked. Bucky glared at his brother, nodding his head in disgust. "Have you ever seen an animal's neck bent in that direction whilst it was still living?" Bart, stunned by the gruesome scene, merely nodded. For a long moment both men remained silent, calculating a possible solution that might involve getting the broken wagon up the hill. "Without that wagon, we're going to have to walk back to Abilene," Bart said. "Yeah," Bucky replied. The men glared at each other and seemed about to tussle a second time when the mule, pinned around the hackberry tree, regained consciousness. With a snort, the unfortunate animal began braying once again. Both men turned in horror. "Dang, Bucky, we gotta cut it loose," Bart said. "We can't cut it loose, you dang fool," Bucky yelled. "You tied the other mule off at the end of the wagon. We gotta get that other animal before we cut this rope, or the wagon is liable to roll over it too. Then we're gonna be walking and carrying all our stuff to boot." Bart, perhaps befuddled by the mule's heart-rending death knell, seemed not to hear. Instead, he pulled his knife from the small scabbard attached to his waist. Nebulous to anything but his task, Bart stumbled forward, planning to cut the rope, despite his brother's protest. "Bart, don't cut that damn rope!" Unfortunately, Bart, perhaps deafened by the mule's screeching, didn't pause. The hemp lariat had gained the hardness that often comes to such ropes after a few months of service, and didn't cut easily. Even so, Bucky could see the line wouldn't last long with Bart sawing on it. Once the rope was cut, the wagon below would roll over the second, still healthy mule, leaving them without any means of carrying their gear. In an instant, Bucky drew his pistol and shot his brother in the right forearm. It should be noted that Bucky, an avid fan of Western stories where men with sidearms occasionally disarm an attacking marauder with a gunshot, did not intend to shoot his brother in the arm. When Bucky pulled his gun, he envisioned shooting the knife cleanly from Bart's hand. Later, as his brother's condition worsened, Bucky would point out repeatedly that he had only missed by a few inches. With a surprised groan, Bart dropped the knife and sank slowly to the ground. "Why the hell did you do that?" he asked. Bucky didn't answer, but instead walked down the hillside to release the second mule. In the meantime, the injured mule atop the hill continued to cry out, its death call fluctuating between a coughing honk and a hideous bray. Bart lay on his back on the ground, his head swimming as he looked in a distant, detached way at the blood oozing from the bullet hole in his forearm. 5 minutes later, Bucky, completely winded and leading the healthy mule, arrived back atop the hillside, gathered Bart's knife from the ground, and cut the line. They watched as the wagon on 3 wheels lurched, then rolled, then crashed to the bottom of the ravine. Bucky drew his pistol and placed the barrel against the temple of the now collapsed but still braying mule and put the animal out of its misery. Bucky looked at his brother, then at the dead mule, and then at a stand of cottonwood trees still a mile away. He had been hoping to make it to the trees that evening. With a deep sigh, he strode back down the hillside and loaded what he could onto the remaining mule. They would rest for a day or two, then head back to Abilene. Perhaps in that time, they could come up with a story to explain the loss of the wagon. In today's plate of history beans, I'll take a quick look at dime novels from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Over the years, the American obsession with the Old West has changed in some ways, but in a sense, things have remained remarkably the same. Today's Longmire or Yellowstone, and indeed an entire range of interests that even include science fiction, while sexier and more attuned to modern sensibilities, share a lot of the traits found in dime novels about detectives, explorers, mountain men, fashionable ladies, romantic encounters, and fanciful journeys to the Earth's center or even the moon. The more I look at the variety of dime novels available for readers in the mid-19th century, the more I realize that people weren't much different then than they are now. They enjoyed good stories about a variety of topics. First, let's define the term dime novel. Dime novels weren't books in the modern sense. They were closer to today's periodicals or magazines. Dime novels were often published on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis. They usually contained continuing stories featuring specific characters. Like modern soap operas or television series, each segment would have some climactic moment so readers would look forward to the next week's adventures. They provided entertainment for readers before radio, television, social media, or smartphones. Dime novels were priced cheaply to appeal to working folks at the time. Starting around 1860, the popularity of dime novels exploded across the United States. The success of these publications can be attributed mainly to a couple of factors. First, advances in printing technology and paper production allowed publishers to quickly print large numbers of their dime novels. In addition to automated printing, publishers could ship their story papers, as they were often called, via rail to almost anywhere in the United States. At first, this meant that you could get the latest copy of your favorite hero's exploits almost anywhere east of the Mississippi, starting in 1860. Within a decade, with the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, story papers, or dime novels, became easily available everywhere. Mercantile stores and other retail businesses from Maine to San Francisco would stock the booklets, and people, hungry for entertainment, bought them in huge numbers. It should be noted that serialized stories in papers were not a new thing. Many of you probably know that authors like Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and a host of others published their novels in European newspapers in serialized format even earlier in the 19th century. I mentioned some well-known authors just now. It should be noted that dime novels weren't and aren't generally notable for their literary quality, though without doubt the people writing the stories took their work and livelihood seriously. As I said already, the dime novels were produced with working people in mind. Most people could afford a nickel or a dime for a booklet that contained 40 to 80 pages about their favorite characters. Indeed, with the advent of public schools and public libraries in the mid-19th century and the consequent growth in general literacy, dime novels grew more and more popular until they were replaced by magazines, radio, and other media starting around 1920. That meant for a lot of folks in the years between 1860 and 1920, one of their biggest forms of entertainment was the lowly dime novel. In my book Hunting Charm, the two heroes have a degree of notoriety because they appear in serialized dime novels. I'll let you as the reader figure out who writes those stories, but there are a few hints in the book. In a sense, I've tried to pay some tribute to the story paper tradition with my characters Matt and Brant. They are meant to emulate some of the popular heroes that appeared in dime novels of the time. There were dime novels that featured the fictionalized exploits of actual men like Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill Cody, Davy Crockett, and outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James. There were also purely fictional characters like Deadwood Dick, Roving Joe, Buckskin Sam, and a host of others. At the time, these Old West heroes would have been called frontiersmen. The term cowboy became popularized later, but the emphasis on gunplay, heroism, frontier chivalry, romance, and Judeo-Christian values isn't much different from today's TV shows like the aforementioned Yellowstone and Longmire. Instead of pickups and semi-auto handguns and rifles, the dime novels featured men on Arabians, thoroughbreds, pinto ponies, firing six-shooters and big 50 rifles, saving fragile heroines from brutal savages or wild animals, or braving the wild, untamed frontier. There's a lot more I could say about dime novels, story papers, and dime westerns. If you're interested in learning more about these publications, I'll share a few links in the comments below. That's all for today's chapter from Hunting Charm and a plate of history beans about dime novels. Once again, if you like my channel, I hope you'll take a second to hit the subscribe and like buttons. I'll see you again next week for more from the contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles.